You're listening to Future Artifacts FM, a bi-monthly podcast and broadcast featuring speculative fiction audio works by artists and writers, produced and presented by Nina Davies,
Rebecca Edwards,
and Neve Schmidtke on RTM,
and also available wherever you get your podcasts.
The programme focuses on fictional works intended for broadcast to carve out a better understanding of the now by exploring various interpretations of the future.
Together with guests, we discuss the mechanics of different types of storytelling to reveal the complexities of contemporary culture. Let's get started.
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 A note before listening to the show. This conversation includes discussions about transgender identities and was recorded before the UK Supreme Court ruling on April 16th. All trans women are women and all trans men are men. Love and solidarity to everyone in the trans community.
Welcome back to Future Artifacts FM. I am Nina Davies.
I'm Rebecca Edwards.
And this is Neve Schmidtke. Welcome to episode 27. We're doing something quite new in this episode. We're going to be doing a recap of our new weird miniseries, which is very exciting. So this episode, we're not going to have any guests, but it's going to be myself, Nina, and Rebecca speaking to some of the themes that we explored in those 4 episodes, and also reflecting a bit within our own research and interests, what we think the weird is now, and kind of how we're processing the work that we've been doing over the last few months. Yeah?
Yeah, I think so.
So to recap before we start off, we wanted to read you a little bit of our initial statement that we put together about what the new weird was for us. So for this mini-series, we were exploring what weird means. Inspired by the new weird, we want to build and consider what kinds of technologies, structures, and disciplines can be explored through this sentiment. We're interested in locating the slippage between where something becomes weird or familiar, for example, the inclusion of generated images in news articles. We're interested in works that challenge the flatness of science fiction and expand notions of storytelling. Some examples of how this flatness can be challenged are ways the uncanny can be used as a tool for repositioning deteriorating notions of good and evil into amorphic forces, or interrogating different dimensions as multiplanar realities.
Yeah, and I think it's important for us to also situate some places where this work has been done a little bit before we came to this, because there have been definitions of the new weird as early as probably even earlier.
Well, even weird. There's like
Well, yeah.
weird, and then there's new weird.
That's true.
And then, yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to speak about weird?
I don't really know whether I know like enough about it. Just gonna admit that, but I do know that what's his name? Edgar Allan Poe is like one of like I would imagine is like sort of one of the classical sort of like weird writers.
It's funny because I was reading Mary Shelley when we recorded Phil's episode, Frankenstein, which is also of that same genre of this kind of moment of weirdness. And I was thinking a bit on this in relation to the new weird, and then we jump into some of the research that Rebecca's done about that moment of this kind of 1800s weird genre in relation to things like the Industrial Revolution and this moment of kind of industrialized technologies becoming much more prevalent and widespread. Also like Enlightenment theory and just the world becoming a more rational place. So maybe needing the weird to also like work against that rationalization somehow. And the Mary Shelley Frankenstein is kind of playing on those ideas of science of like, how do you make a creature? But then the morals of what happens when you don't treat that creature with care, you know, because then the Frankenstein goes around and kind of keeps murdering people that are important to its creator. So yeah, that feels a bit where weird is coming from for me.
Yeah, and I think and I don't know whether this is what you're going to kind of go into, Rebecca, when you're kind of recapping what sort of new weird is. But also I remember when we were beginning to talk about doing this mini series, we kind of all like went away and did like little bits of research. And I think one of the things that, correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the things that really stuck in my head was that the idea with weird weird fiction, and I think also new weird as well, or maybe this is just new weird, is that there's kind of no sense of like good or evil with weirding. Is that it's kind of some sort of amorphic force that drives the plot, but there's not really, yeah. So like bad things might happen or good things might happen, but they're not necessarily like, they don't necessarily have agency behind them, or there's no, and so therefore it plays with, I guess, your perception of like whether what is happening, like whether it matters what's happening is good or bad. Anyways, okay, I'm going to pass over to you now, Rebecca.
Well, I mean, I'm not like the leading voice of like new weird,
but you are
new weird theory. But yeah, I guess just to bring it back to the new weird and kind of how this came about. So in 2008, Jeff and Anne Vandermeer. So Jeff Vandermeer is like a renowned sci-fi writer. He wrote the Annihilation trilogy and things like this. So yeah, they released a book in 2008 called The New Weird, and in it they proposed that the new weird was crystallized with the publication of China Mieville's Perdido Street Station, this huge book that came out in the 2000s, and it marked a shift from traditional weird fiction like Lovecraft to urban secondary world narratives that fully embrace the strange. So I'm just going to actually read Jeff and Anne's working definition of the new weird as it was in 2008. Urban secondary world fiction that subverts romanticized fantasy tropes using realistic, complex models, often blending science fiction, fantasy, and surreal horror, deeply aware of the modern world and defined by immersive world building. Don't really like that word, but defined by immersive world building and a surrender to the weird. So there's this idea that you're surrendering to it, as you said, Nina. It's not like this force of good and evil. So that's where it kind of was in 2008, and then since then, I mean, there's been a whole load of stuff on the weird in itself, and kind of, you know, Eric Davis's High Weirdness that came out, his essay The Weird and the Banal from 2023, which came up on his Burning Shore Substack. He talks a lot about this idea of counterculture and psychedelia and this like unknowable beyond of the weird. But he links this to AI, which I would like to go into later, but we'll get back to that. You've also obviously got Mark Fisher's idea of the weird. So this idea of there being something present, but that it doesn't belong, which it counters his idea of the eerie, which is the absence. So it's this idea of presence or absence. But then, yeah, so Elvia Wilk as well wrote an essay about the new weird in 2019 that kind of was similar to what the Vandermeers was saying. But in it, she's kind of talking about relocating the weird to be something from the outside to something within. So for Elvia, this idea of the new weird is deeply rooted in nature and the landscape of feminism. So in it, she's like calling to mind all of these authors that have written about women becoming plants, or this like entanglement of nature and bodies, the idea of becoming inextricably linked to the earth. So she's kind of coming at it from a different angle, I would say, than the Vandermeers. But within all of this, there's this idea of like the weird having, or the new weird having potential, like this kind of like present potential that you can't really grasp. So that's kind of in a roundabout way where I guess we came to then looking into the artists that we worked with.
Yeah, maybe just as a recap, we spoke with or invited Phil Speakman. Is it Phil Speakman or Philip Speak? Anyway, some people might know him as Philip. Some people might know him as Phil. I think either works. And Phil had made a work which was like a live. No, it wasn't a live action role play. It was like a tabletop, like D&D style game. But it was like a game within a game, or it was like a script within a script, wasn't it?
Yeah, he was kind of referencing D&D logic within within the script. So the players were playing a game, but then they also entered into another game. So it was like an Inception.
Right. Yeah.
That was episode 23. Episode 24 was with Jelena Viskovic, whose work Modo Nation, we showed an audio clip from the longer film that she made last year, which was more around forms of individual versus collective desire. And I think maybe one thing that's helpful, or we'll go into across this recap, is also the different terms that we learnt from different artists along the way. So, for example, with Philip's work, it was around weirding. So, tools of weirding, not thinking about speculating or world building, but weirding. And with Jelena as well, a very distinct act against speculation, not as thinking about how financial markets are speculated upon, or let's say these kind of massive world building projects, but instead thinking about surrealism as well, which kind of in a way falls within kind of this world of perhaps the weird and the eerie, but is more so a political gesture, I would say. Then we had Chris MacInnes's Impotent Island, which was looking at kind of this relationship with chaos theory, but also thinking about the relationship of the body to place and to industrialization, and sort of how do you wrap your identity, or how your identity can become wrapped around this form of industry that can no longer exist, and what are you left with when you have that absence, which in itself is an inherently weird or strange thing. Also coming back to kind of the Mark Fisher, that absence. And then our last episode was with Monya Riachi, concerning geographies and tangled histories, in which I think one of the big things that came out of that, at least from my side, was conflicting the word world building as a colonial gesture. And so how do we think about forms of speculative fiction against world building through Monya's practice in map making?
So, I guess moving on from that is, I guess the point of this conversation is also for us to kind of be, the three of us are going to kind of talk about what we think the next new weird is, as well as sort of reflect on these previous episodes that Neve's just explained way better than I was gonna do. I couldn't even get the name right of the artist. So what we're gonna do is the three of us are gonna kind of like introduce something, maybe not like a complete theme. They're not really gonna be well thought through, or at least mine's not going to be. And we're just going to kind of talk about what things that we see are emerging right now, or things that we're thinking about at the moment, that we think might be taking weird into like the next moment, or the next decade, or I don't know.
As in our preparation for this, we were all joking that we're more so bringing you opinions than references in this episode. We'll be referencing the previous artists' works that we've been kind of embedded in for the past few months, but it's much more so a free flowing space. We're going to anchor it a bit in the statement that we've written, and so thinking about kind of what are technology structures or disciplines within the different episodes, and using that to help kind of root our individual forms of research, as Rebecca was talking about with AI. Maybe that's a really nice place to start, to talk with the AI.
Sure, yeah, we can start there.
Yeah. Just put you on this. But kind of using these forms of language. Also, we're aware that there are kind of many artists and students who are kind of listening to the show and thinking about if there's things that you've picked up through these episodes that you're trying to think about, how do I explore this within my own practice or my own research. That's a little, this is a little bit what we're thinking about now as well.
Yeah. Yeah, we can definitely start with AI. I mean, it's an incredibly large field, so maybe I'll focus it a little bit more on Eric Davis's essay, where he's also looking more at AI and weird. Okay, so in this essay, The Weird and the Banal, he's kind of saying that traditional weirdness implies mystery, counterculture, ontological uncertainty, etc. All of this is linked to the occult, psychedelia, high strangeness, but AI often lacks this kind of radical otherness. And I think this is a really interesting point, because I think to maybe break it down a little bit, if we're talking about AI here, I think what I'm talking about is like text to image, text to video kind of AI. No, I'm not talking about like huge AI infrastructures that deal with like economics. I'm really talking about the kind of artistic use of these tools.
Do you mean like generative AI?
Generative AI, yeah. So I think when things like DALL-E, Midjourney, these kinds of tools first came out, they were weirder, like they were inherently weirder. But now that they're advancing, with this advancement comes with it a lot of predictability, obviously a lot more data for these tools to be trained on and to give output of. And so, yeah, generative AI now for me lacks this kind of radical otherness. It's predictive, it's statistical, and it's born from these bureaucratic systems, or these systems that are kind of headed up by these people that kind of don't want it to be a weird tool, as far as I can tell. Like, there's been a lot of controversy at the minute around like Studio Ghibli within AI data sets, and obviously there's a lot of artistic movements against having your work in these data sets.
Yeah, sorry, no, I was just going to say the Studio Ghibli is such an interesting like reference, or like just because I would say that Studio Ghibli is they work like within the realm of the weird, and it's interesting that they're sort of like, it's sort of like the like, we don't want, I don't know whether that's not necessarily what they're saying, but it does feel a little bit like this is our territory. Like, yeah. Sorry, carry on.
But yeah, so thinking about so in this article, he warns against pseudo weirdness, something that he calls pseudo weirdness, which in the case of AI is technology that looks novel, but is just a remix of norms or commodified quirkiness. And I was thinking about this in relation to like, Neve, you're probably too young to remember this, but when we were young, it would be like, people would be like, oh my God, I'm so random.
Oh yeah.
Like, and you're not.
Yeah.
Do you remember that? Sorry, but like, I think he talks about this.
I was thinking about that on my way here. I was like, early millennial culture was like so much about randomness and like weirdness. It was like something to aspire to be, but for no reason. Like, it's so random.
Yeah.
I'm thinking the kind of like raw like images like of emo kids.
Yeah.
Which also feels like quite random in a way that suddenly that just became a craze that like everyone was doing.
Yeah.
With like the big side swoop fringe and then
which is born off a counterculture, might I add.
Yeah.
But he's talking about this thing of keep Austin weird, with this state.
Austin, Texas.
Texas, not the state.
Yeah.
Anyway, so he's like, warning against this pseudo weirdness and proposing an ethics of weirdness. So I know that this isn't exactly in the realm of the new weird, but I will get to that. So he talks about embracing risk, magic, improvisation, and openness to the unknown as a counter to these bland simulations that AI is kind of coming up with. And for me, this is kind of interesting to think about, right? Like, as I said, like, these tools were inherently weird, but now they're just kind of regurgitating themselves. They're kind of becoming more and more realistic. I mean, Nina, you can probably definitely speak to this as well, because you're looking at this in your work at the moment.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I'm thinking about how does this play into this idea of the next new weird, and what becomes of these technological and algorithmic structures when weirdness gets added back in. So I'm thinking about manipulation of imagery, right? Like, that's one thing that we can definitely point towards when we think about AI, and, you know, everything from Yves Klein to Swaggy Pope. Like, what happens? What does this bring to the table of weirding or new weirding the image? And I think for me here, there's definitely something about the digital weird, and thinking about everything from like the balkanization of the internet, all the way through to like this idea of the digital weird is being like, the weird here is no longer just the intrusion of alien forms into familiar spaces, but it's the realization that the familiarity is already alien. So these AIs are spitting out stuff that we know, but it's also, it's so familiar.
It doesn't come from anywhere that's actually, I mean, it, like, obviously it is coming from the training data, which is real data. Like, well, we don't necessarily know whether it's real data or not, but sorry, I'm just thinking about this. Someone told me about a fake data company, and like there's like actual companies that sell fake data, and it's like a whole thing. So, but anyways, that's another rabbit hole to go down. But like these images, like this is sort of like what I'm looking at with what I'm making at the moment, right now, where the like these images or these things, they're not captured. They're not an imprint of the real world. They're like complete fabulations, but presented to us in the form of an image, which we can only ever relate to as being like archival, or like that's what our relationship to it has been for a long time. Like, take that, what I'm saying, with a pinch of salt, because of course, like we have fictional films and fictional images, and we understand that fiction operates within images, but there's now this, like, I don't know, but even though images are fictional, they always somewhat relate in terms of, if I'm going off track here, but they do kind of always relate to something that is real. Like, even if it's even if it is an edited image, it's still like an image has been taken that you're editing with. Whereas now, like, these images of humans, this human might potentially not exist unless you've been put in Elon Musk. Like,
and
I'm thinking of something when we were preparing for this episode, and we were kind of like figuring out these different avenues we wanted to talk about. One of the big things that I'm thinking about as well, Rebecca, when talking about this weirdness of, I'm thinking particularly like in the 2000s and the 2010s, the weirdness of a lot of kind of social media spaces, or like spaces people would gather online. And I'm thinking about part of that being around different forms of media literacy, in terms of how much you could do with Photoshop, or how much you could do with word art, as well as like lending into the weirdness, because there was only so much accuracy that you could get in any image. Whereas now, there's a level of accuracy in AI generated images that, as you're saying, are getting better and better. And I'm wondering how this literacy that we have, and kind of how we're reading images, that they are fictional, that they are generated, that they are factual, if those terms even make sense anymore in kind of reading digital imagery, how this is a distinct marker in what the next new weird is,
100%,
as we get this slippage. But also thinking about, so then what does that mean? Is introducing the weird, or is like back into these systems, or not introducing, bringing them back in, but also like roles of weirding, is that also something around our own media literacy that we need to relearn, or we need to kind of develop as a toolkit for ourselves? Like, I'm not,
yeah. I think what these tools often do is they sort of distort meaning, and they kind of they fragment things across different zones, whether that's time zone, language zone, whatever that is. And I think this is what I was trying to get at with this idea of the balkanization of the internet, is like, by weirding, I feel like there's also this fragmentation where nobody really understands anyone anymore, where we can't trust imagery, where there's like, you have things like Skibbity Toilet, and kids understand that, but adults don't. To me, like, the Skibbity Toilet is essentially the same as an AI generated image of the Pope wearing a puffer jacket. Like, it's born out of this like instability of ourselves, and like not really knowing what ground, like the ground that we're standing on is not stable anymore.
You spoke to me a while ago about model collapse, and about this about like model collapse being this sort of like, eventually at some point, when these generative models have been trained, like there is now more. I think there's like more generated images on the internet than there are like real images. So at some point, those images become part of the training data for new models, and at some point, like that's where like the model collapses. It doesn't. It's not basing what it's generating off of. It doesn't relate to the real world anymore. But I also think that there is that's also happening with us. It's like not model collapse, but it's like human. Well, I use this term in the script for what I'm working on at the moment, but I call it like perception collapse, where it's like, is that what is also happening to us? Like we're getting fed images that we sometimes you just know an image is AI, but there are some that are very believable, and like there's a point where like how much like I'm sure everyone can relate to this, of like saying something to someone where you're like, oh my god, did you hear about XYZ? And someone's like, are you sure that that's real? Like, I think actually even like the Pope, like I think when I first saw that image, I thought no, it was the Harry Potter people doing Balenciaga. I was like, oh my god, that is such a great campaign, that Balenciaga. Like, I believed it, because I was like, that's genius.
Yeah, I think there's also something quite weird about like I see a lot of exhibitions at the minute interrogating these things, but then there will be people on social media like plugging this show when it's actually supposed to be critiquing this stuff, and it feels like such a backwards loop of perception. But yeah, there's also something in what you were saying around how we're actually all just becoming a little bit more infiltrated into this system, and the way that we're thinking is very systematized now. I think I was speaking to you about this, like how television shows, or maybe you were speaking to me about this, how television shows now, they always have recaps. They're always kind of made in such a way that allows for you to scroll on your phone at the same time as watching it.
Oh yeah, no, it's it's what's it called, secondary screen watching, where it's where they're designed, the plot plays out on a much slower timescale, because they know everyone is like playing a game on their phone or working on their computer, which is why. But then also flip side of that, which is also why some of these shows are unbearable to sit down and watch if you actually want to put your devices away, because there is no plot, or the plot takes so long for it to happen that you're like, I'm trying to think like Bridgerton or something like that. Like, that's a show I could not sit down and watch because it took too long to get to where I was trying to go.
Sorry, Nina and I are sharing a mic this episode, so if you hear us like screaming across one another, but it's making me think a lot about. I just finished watching Adolescence, which is massive right now. The reason why I bring it into this is because they're one-shot episodes, and so there's something quite interesting for me in that's kind of countering this second screen writing, which also just drives my head in, because then the writing is just unbearable and you can feel your brain cells dying as you're watching. What, with Adolescence? No, with like Bridgerton, as in like wonderful, pompous, fluffy end of day stuff. But I think with Adolescence, because it's this 1 hour typically long take, that there's a liveness to it. And I think in particular, because there is an element of the show, and this is not a spoiler, there's an element of the show about how this teenager's life acts online versus in person, in terms of the version of himself that is seen online versus the version of him that is seen by his parents in the flesh, let's say. That there's something very powerful in the single take, where you're kind of forced to pay attention, because it's real life, and if you blink, you'll miss it. And I think there's something about that maybe slightly segues to what I'm thinking about with the weird, but I don't want to quite cut off the AI conversation just yet. But one of the things I'm thinking about a lot when we're talking about this weirdness in terms of a digital weird is what that means in terms of certain forms of embodied politics, or just like fleshiness. Like, how do, if our online and digital spaces are becoming increasingly, or they just are increasingly significant parts of our day-to-day, what does that mean for the bodies we inhabit, in terms of how those bodies move through the world, and how also thinking about this form of like next new weird in terms of image generation, because it's built off of what's already there, of course, how that perpetuates standards that we know are, racist or misogynist or transphobic. Like, if we understand that those things are already inherent in many data sets just based off who historically has been more represented online, what does that mean for the very bodies and flesh that we have if those things no longer represent those historical like hierarchies?
Yeah, before you go into that, and just to kind of round off my bit by referring to an actual episode that we did, I'm thinking a lot about Phil's episode and this kind of adoption of character within this narrative of game making, and how I've been doing a lot of thinking around tabletop roleplay games at the moment and kind of inhabiting different people. And for me, like, the next new weird also lies in this creation, or like the collective imagination of a group of people. So this liminal space where it's not the written word that you're kind of discussing. It's also not solely imaginary in one person's head, but it's weirded, or next new weirded, in the fact that it exists only as a collective construct within a particular moment, with a particular set of people, and with these dice rolled randomized decisions. So maybe that's a good way of kind of transitioning into what you're saying about embodied, this idea of embodied weirdness, or weirding the body, because that happens a lot within tabletop roleplay games and gaming in general, actually.
Yeah, completely. I mean, there was, because I think when we were initially talking about the new weird, it's funny because we sat down in a sunny park. No, we sat down in a sunny garden in like, August, July of last year. And it was just after the general election. So there was a general feeling about what politics are going to look like in the next few years, kind of having a change. Labour government got in, and having that change. And sort of, I think for me as well, I was thinking a lot about this idea of like the other or anarchy, and like what can politics provide for us, or kind of how do we claim back those terms, and thinking about the weird as being this very slippery term as well, this like amorphic term that can be good or bad. So like, does it give us tools then? And perhaps as we've been working more and more on this series, one of the things that I keep on thinking a lot about is this form of embodied politics, and what happens when the body you inhabit is labeled as weird, and thinking about that as sort of a slippage point. And of course, right now there's, so we're recording in spring of 2025. Trump has been in office for 4 months, and there's many scary policies that he's enacting, many very violent and unsafe ones. But the thing that I'm thinking a lot about is those that are against trans people, such as kind of returning trans people's passports cut up, reissuing passports with the gender they were born at birth, not the gender that they have transitioned to or that they identify as. Things like genital searches as people are entering into countries. Many European nations are warning gender non-conforming people to enter into the US right now. And it's making me think a lot about kind of weirdness in terms and forms of weirding as like a place of reclamation versus a place of slippage. And what I mean by that is I'm thinking about Trump's first term in office, and how it felt like there was this moment in the 2010s where there was a lot of queer rights that were being won in terms of access to different forms of trans healthcare, being able to self-identify your gender, things like there was the marriage equality referendum in Ireland in 2015, and then later on in that year, I think Barack Obama did an executive order to legalize gay marriage across all of the states. And there was this wave of rights that kind of came out, and it felt very positive. And then something started to slip, and homophobia and transphobia rose again as queer people were being considered weird or more weird or othered. And I'm thinking about that slippage of weird as a term that you can claim versus weird as a term that is placed onto you. And part of that is around the term queer. So queer being kind of an old synonym of like peculiar, and also as a derogatory term, as a slur towards gay people historically, kind of emerging in like the 1800s and then continuing to the 1980s when the term got reclaimed. And now you hear many people say, oh, I'm queer. And it's a very joyful thing to say that, and it's sort of emblematic of a part of gay culture that is, I would say, more political in terms of just because I have the right to get married means I can choose not to, and kind of choices around non-heteronormative structures. And I guess for me, the way I'm thinking about that is in Jelena's episode, in particular, how she talks about forms of embodied politics in terms of understanding history with the re-performing of historical avant-garde art by this post-98 generation as a way for them to understand or to kind of get an embodied understanding of their own like context, perhaps not necessarily their history, but their context. And I'm thinking about that form of surrealism or weirdness as being both slippage of othering, but also as space of reclamation.
Yeah, so I was just thinking about because the only thing that I'm sort of really kind of clued into in what's happening sort of in the current discourse is about the passports being reissued to people with their with the gender they were assigned with at birth rather than the one they've chosen or transitioned to. And it's funny because then I was thinking about, Rebecca, what you were saying at the beginning of the episode, kind of when you're introducing this idea of the weird, and you were talking about Mark Fisher and about sort of presence and absence, because I feel like there's something there with not, I don't want to say like erasure, but there is kind of like a an absence that they're trying that the US government is trying to create there, of being like, it's not that we're going to call you weird, we're just gonna make we're going to get rid of what you claim you are, and we're just going to see that as invisible and ignore it, and we're not going to so it's interesting. But then I was just trying to think about like, what is that link, and maybe Rebecca, whether or you can chime in about Mark Fisher and this idea of like presence, or the eerie and the, you say there's the eerie and the absence.
Yes.
I'm interested whether there's any kind of interesting links that we might be able to make there.
Well, the weird is the presence of something that's, how does he say it? Something that's does not belong. The weird is the presence of something that does not belong, whereas the eerie is is an absence of something. So if you're thinking about a horror film, eerie is like the Blair Witch Project. Weird is like something else where there's like something visible, like The Substance. That I would say that's pretty weird, because that's weird, not eerie.
Because it's presence.
Because it's present.
Yeah. And I mean, just to clarify, I hope it goes without saying, but there's no part of this conversation where we are describing any member of the trans community as weird, unless they choose to identify with that word and they enjoy that word. I guess I think for me, I'm thinking a lot about these parallels of also thinking about kind of the weird and the eerie, but like thinking about the origins of the word queer as peculiar, and peculiarity. Like even like when I grew up, my grandmother used to say, it's like, oh, she's a bit queer, as a way to like talk about someone she thought was odd, you know. And I'm thinking about how that term got reclaimed, but I'm also thinking about maybe certain things within parts of queer culture that are also, in terms of thinking about maybe this role of what you're talking about in terms of certain types of generative AI missing weirdness. I'm also thinking about the connections that might have to certain types of heteronormativity, and queerness as being against that. So it's not about being cisgender, or it's not about being heterosexual, but also things like the ways in which you live might also not be heteronormative in terms of you might be a relationship anarchist, or you might choose to not have a family. I mean, for some people it's not a choice, but thinking about also all those roles of sort of queering and that sense of peculiarity in a way as something that's seen as or framed as positive. And I'm wondering about how this operates in terms of what we're talking about with sort of the estrangement of the next new weird. You know, how does this fall into, let's say, the fleshiness of forms of embodied politics when your identity itself is claimed to be invisible or is claimed to not exist? Kind of, is there something in those slippages of when weird is something that is not violent, you know, in terms of its presence, in terms of someone being called weird on the street, versus perhaps maybe when it slips into the absence? Is the eerie the violent part of it? I don't know.
I don't know. I'm just thinking about, you mentioned erasure, and
I don't know whether erasure is necessarily the right
No.
word to use there.
Maybe it's helpful to think a little bit about Chris's episode in this, an impotent island, and thinking about that way in which, for many northern men, that their identity became in part constructed around industrialization in terms of their ability to work with a steam engine, and what happened in the absence of those industries either descaling or closing down.
Yeah, I think, or maybe not even like just working with a steam engine, but just like getting your hands dirty, like being a miner. Like, your body showed your labor, it showed your work. Like, you had calluses on your hands because you worked really hard. It was kind of like in the same vein as like rich people in like the 1800s would really prefer to be fat because it showed that they had enough money to buy loads of food. You know, it's that kind of idea. But yeah, I think like with this the new industrial revolution, or the kind of new technological revolution that we're going through, I think that definitely shifts things into being something other than that. I was thinking a bit about a little bit like Schrodinger's cat, where you open the box, is the cat alive or dead? And it's kind of this theory of quantum thing that I can't remember.
Quantum physics?
Yeah. But this idea that the weird, for me, it's like it's only weird if it stays under the hood. As soon as it becomes common, cultural, commodified knowledge, it's no longer weird. It's like until it suffers this identification, it's still, by non-weird things, it's still weird. So even by like just saying, oh, that's weird, it's no longer weird because it's known. Do you know what I mean?
I guess I'm thinking about that in relation to what you're saying about Phil's work of like the collective creation of, in terms of like a collective decision making of. And maybe for me that comes back to also this form of thinking about tools of weirding in terms of these forms of embodied politics, and like the tools of weirding also being generative of kind of gathering, or like the collective creation of like, I don't know, I don't even want to think about it as being like emancipatory frameworks because that's asking a lot, but maybe like spaces to rest within. Like we were talking slightly before this about also thinking, you know, when you have such kind of violent political policies that are being enacted against you, as in, I can't go to the States right now because I'm worried that I will be kind of searched in some way because I don't appear feminine enough to a border guard, because I don't decide to assign to the gender I was born as. And thinking about then for me, what are the spaces that I need in order to kind of find safety within, so that if I'm going out into a world that's going to be violent against how I choose to define my gender, It's like, are there roles of weirding that allow me to create or find or have those spaces of kind of safety and protection in maybe either like self-declaring or like claiming this kind of collective weirdness somehow of being like, you're going to call me weird? Yeah, I'll be weird.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, is the next new word for you about reclaiming?
I think so. I think that's where it feels like it's kind of sitting for me right now. I mean, I'm thinking about that a lot in terms of the different terms that the artists we worked with have given us. You know, both in like Monya's rejection of the term world building, in Jelena's specific use of the term surrealism, in Phil's use of the term weirding, and thinking about those series of terms in terms of creating spaces where we get to decide the language that is used to describe us or our work. You know, I think there's a lot of kind of a cultural violence around like being assigned language rather than deciding your language. You know, thinking about the reclamation of the word queer as being one of them. It's like, oh, you're going to use it as a slur? Oh, I'm going to use it to describe my entire identity. And it disarms the violence of the term. And I wonder if there's something around weirding in the present that can help with that.
That kind of segues in perfectly. I don't know whether you set that up for me, but into sort of what I wanted to talk about. And actually, I kind of want to go back really briefly to not, because I feel like on the show we've dabbled with the new weird with other artists, not just like within this mini series. And I remember one episode that we did with Yuli Sarfati when they recommended that we listen to Annihilation, which is I think Jeff. Yeah. And sorry, let me finish that. That was a Jeff Vandermeer book. Is that right?
Yeah, it's a trilogy, but Annihilation is the first book.
Okay.
Yeah.
And there's a scene in it where the character notices that this kind of virus or whatever we want to call it, amorphic force, like it starts to mimic parts of the world. So it, you know, like we see like plants growing in the shapes of animals and humans, and it's and there's one part where it looks like there's some text written on the wall, and the main character walks up to the text to read it, and then it releases its spores into her face. And I thought there was something really interesting about this idea of like language that's not meant to necessarily be read, but the idea is that this virus or whatever understood that if you make something look like language, someone will then read it. That's like that's the reaction that we have to language, which means that someone will walk up close to it and this thing will happen. Anyways, and I've probably spoken about it on the show before, but there's Catherine Hales, who I speak about a lot in relation to my work, has a sort of not prediction, but she proposes this idea that with sort of increasing technological advancement, especially with autonomous systems or autonomous language systems, that we are not the only beings now that understand and use language. Like we now share that with like ChatGPT or like large language models. And so how do we define, her question is sort of how do we define the human against these systems? And for her, she thinks it's with language, and that that for these sort of large language models, meaning has no meaning. So language doesn't relate to the physical world. And she thinks that part of being human is the enjoyment of meaning making and mark making, and that meaning doesn't necessarily have to be like in language in the same way that we understand it, but we have the capacity to kind of expand what making meaning is. And so I'm going somewhere with this. And so she thinks that we will start to see the rise of asemic languages, which is languages that don't belong to any form of semantics. So like in one of her talks, she shows pictures of like pages that look like it's writing, but it's not any sort of language. But the page is still conveying something. And I sort of wanted to. So sorry, that's kind of just a little kind of like where my mind's at with thinking about language and this potential rise of asemic languages. And in the winter, I had gone. This was like after Trump won the election, and I went onto Instagram, and I can't remember what it was, but I think I went onto TikTok, and someone had made a video saying like, look, you can't look up on Instagram, you can't type in Donald Trump rigged the election, but there are like loads of videos of him admitting that he rigged the election. And it said, so you can find these videos if you type in Donald Trump ridged electron. And I was like, this is a complete hoax. This video is not real. But then I was like, I'm just going to try it out. And I typed in rigged election, Donald Trump rigged election, no search results. Like it was like, it had completely censored it. And then I typed in, and I did exactly what this guy had done and put in ridged electron. And and then it was like just like loads and loads of videos of the same clip over and over again. And while like these are still like words that we understand, like a ridged electron is still two words that we understand the meaning of. They have like, for that purpose, they have sort of changed, or there's something about spelling something wrong to gain access to censored material that I wonder whether is kind of this new or maybe like a sort of precursor to the rise of asemic language that Catherine Hales is kind of suggesting that we'll begin to see. Sorry, that was a long.
I think that's a good point, because this is not something new. Yes, now they're using it to try and sort of get away from the algorithm detecting things, like instead of sex in a YouTube video, it would be SEGGS. So it still sounds the same, but it's not.
I'm thinking about, this kind of role of shadow banning.
Yeah.
That you see a lot, both in, when you're thinking about, not necessarily TikTok, but I'm thinking about kind of Instagram, kind of obviously run by Meta, Zuckerberg being a fan of Trump, and then terms that would be against him being shadow banned, or just generally things of political nature. I mean, as we've all seen, I'm sure as well, anyone who's speaking about kind of the ongoing violence in Gaza, people have to rewrite Gaza because that term, that geography is being shadow banned. The same for Palestine, even same for Israel. That these terms are sort of kind of taken off the main feed. And I was thinking a lot before about how these terms, like what gets placed as a term that will be shadow banned, in terms of how does that get decided. I guess thinking before, what we were talking about in terms of like the language, like, or the tools of weirding is like creating these like collective spaces where we can gather. Like, is the version of the word that is not shadow banned, is that collective space? Thinking about this amazing moment where all these young people on TikTok bought the tickets to Trump's rally and then danced around them on TikTok rather than going to the rally, and then he was left in this empty stadium. And so that new form of like the asemic language that they would have created to have not had that be a shadow banned event, is that what that collectivity is? But then I guess there's, on the other hand of it, there's this worrying thing about maybe the weird and counterculture around things that typically would have been quite normal now needing to be part of a counterculture, such as voicing an anger towards your president, voicing an anger towards your political leaders more generally, sort of who gets to decide what falls in and out of that asemic language.
But I think that you've got something there in terms of, thinking around maybe also computer language. I mean, there's a lot of kind of fear around the idea that AIs are sentient and that they can talk to each other and that they have a language that we don't understand that's all around us but we can't see it. So I think you've definitely got something there, but it also reminds me of, do you remember like, I don't know, the Amazon sort of like makeup brushes that have like, it's this word soup and it's like every single word to try and get the algorithm to feature them at the top. So it would be like makeup, kids, colourful eyeshadow, hairstyle, 90s, and it's like all of these words to try and get it to the top of the algorithm. What you're saying is kind of the opposite, but it's similar to me.
Yeah, well, and I guess it's sort of like this idea of like I don't know whether it's weirding language or like, I mean, you could describe it as that, or like embracing error as a sort of human, like something that humans can almost kind of see beyond. Yeah, so I think about even like, and I have included this in like one of my older films, but like reCAPTCHA technology. It's like we're able to read like warped phrases. We're able to, some of us who are dyslexic can read misspelling, like it's quite severe misspellings in words, and still be able to understand it or read it upside down. Whereas, how well can a computer, like if an algorithm knows what ridged and electron mean, is it going to be able to? Well, I mean, it can do that, but yeah.
The thing with like moderation is that actually a lot of it is done by people, low-paid workers in India, for example, who have to look through content. So it's not all done by computers, which is interesting. But yes, I mean, theoretically, you could teach a computer. You could teach.
You can teach a computer to do anything. Yeah.
But they are trained to be perfect. They're trained not to make spelling mistakes. They're trained, like these large language models, I mean, they're kind of not trained to be glitchy. The glitch is not what they want, you know? The glitch for them is not Legacy Russell's space for kind of reinterpreting failure, you know? That's bad. That's a bad thing. For them, it's binary.
So is like embracing failure part of like weird?
Well, the next new word.
Yeah, is that the next new weird? Embracing failure, or like embracing the glitch? Sorry, it feels weird to end it there, but I feel like
I think you're right around that weirding the language. I mean, there's a certain element of this that maybe we're coming back to, or in my mind, I feel like we're coming back to, of like enabling space for mistakes and failure through the language of weirding somehow. That there's something around the roles of binary in terms of like, we speak about like good and evil in the statement. I'm thinking even this conversation we're having around embodied politics and different forms of trans care as well, around, you know, an expectation that someone's going to fall within a specific binary of gender that, you know, is just so untrue. And thinking about weird and like this next new weird and weirding, does it allow space to get outside of that binary in terms of the spectrum of choices of like, you know, good and bad is so boring. There's so much in between. You know, having just male and female or man and woman also is like, there's so much more in between. So does weirding also give us the space to think through those forms of language and creating those spaces where we can have that?
I see it as like a splintering of groups as well. Like everybody wants to be part of something, and I think the next new word exists not as one thing, but as a splintering off of different groups where a select few know about a select thing, and that exists infinitely.
Well, I think we're gonna have to end there.
This was good.
Yeah.
This was great to recap on what we've done.
Yeah. It's like it's a whole new format. Well, it obviously won't be every episode will be like this, but hopefully there will be another mini series, which we're kind of starting to cook up, but I don't want to jinx it.
I mean, let us know if you enjoy this format, or if you don't, because we're enjoying sharing these kind of background. Hot takes. As we said, more opinions than references. But thank you.
Let us know. 0800 new word.
You have our Insta. Thanks for listening, guys, as always.
See you next time.
See you next time. Bye.
Bye.